Welcome. I'm Susan Young, Mindful Coaching, and today we're going to explore integrating mindfulness with a deeper understanding of the task processing network and the default mode network. You might already be familiar with the DMN, which is much more common. So I'm just going to share my screen with you so that you can follow along with some of what I'm saying here. Okay. So as I'm learning a lot more about how neuroscience integrates with mindfulness, and we've talked about the default mode network before, and now we're going to add the task positive network. So I've started off with this quote from Dan Siegel, who you might be familiar. He's the one who did the brain activation thing. He's a neuroscientist in UCLA and has started his own mindfulness center. So he says the mind is an embodied and relational process regulating the flow of energy and information. And we can learn to link the differentiated elements. So really what he's saying there is what I'm learning is as I grow more about understanding what the DMN and the TPN do, they're like the two of the largest networks in our brain, and they're like the yin and the yang, and they help us and hold us back, both things at the same time. So what we're learning how to do neuroscientifically in terms of the actual brain itself is to shift from the DPN to the TPN consciously using our tools of mindfulness. So you might remember that the DPN, and I've shown you this before, is the default mode network. When our mind wanders in the past or the future, planning and learning, it's used when we daydream, create, and make meaning, and it's involved when we think about ourselves or others. So self-referential, what are they thinking? What about them? Me, what am I thinking, worry about? And it's needed like when you sit down to do a puzzle or the Sudoku or crossword. Those are all things where the DPN is needed. But often the DPN is negative. And when we feel lonely, frustrated, anxious, guilty, the dark side of our consciousness, which is the author of Flow, Csikszentmihalyi, talks about that that's what the DMN does. So that picture I shared last week about you're standing at the kitchen, you're doing the dishes, you look out, you see the red cardinal, you remember that your cardinal you saw last year before your mom died, you feel grief, then you feel worried about your own death, so it takes us down a dark way, the DPN, and these are the parts of the brain that light up. What they said when I did a bit more research was this green part on the left that I'm circling, that's the part that's taking us into the future, that's at the front of the brain, and this part, the posterior cingulate, is the part that lights up when we're worrying about. So when you're remembering your mom and you're thinking about the cardinal you saw last year and then your mom and her death, that's lighting up this part of the brain. And then when we start to worry about our own death in the future, that lights up that part of the brain. There's other parts of the brain involved as well. So now let's turn to the task positive network, which is new for us in terms of we haven't approached it before. So the research is showing us now in neuroscience that when we're actively paying attention to the task at hand and using our short-term memory and in the present moment, that's when the task positive network is lit up. So it's that flow state, if you really love fixing your bike and you spend an hour and 2 hours go by and you're like, whoa, that was so much fun. You're in the flow state and you're in the task positive network. And it can direct our conscious attention to our senses, like feel your feet right now, whether you're lying down or sitting up. Just kind of feel your feet, wiggle the toes, wiggle your feet, kind of have a sense, when we talk about the air that we might feel or the breeze on our skin. So that's the task positive network that's lit up when we're doing that. So it directs our conscious attention. So this is the part we're activating when we're doing mindfulness. So anything external that pulls on us, but also internal. So when we turn our consciousness to breathing, just do that right now as you're listening. You're aware of your feet, bring them to stillness, and then just breathe in, feeling the coolness at the nostrils. So that what happens there is the TPN lights up, and the DPN, the part that often worries, that fades away. So what we want to do today is we want to integrate these two concepts. If they don't make sense to you, if there's any questions, we're going to pause in a moment and just talk about anything more you want to know. I'm also learning this. I'm taking this course, Neuroscience and Change, with a neuroscientist, and I'm reading about it and doing the research, and then I'm working towards integrating it to bring it to you. So I'm probably a bare breath in terms of learning, and I invite you to ask any questions that don't make sense, anything that you feel you want to add to it. And
I
then
have a question. Is now the time?
Sure. Yeah.
Well, can you remind me what DMN is?
Default mode network.
Which means we're focusing on the past or the future.
So the default is like when we're not concentrating on something external, well, or internal, because it can include the breath and the body. When we're not concentrating on a task of some kind, when we're not present here and now,
yeah,
the default mode network, it's almost like a passive network that just kicks in when we're just kind of meandering with our thoughts, when we're just kind of hanging around. Yeah, so it's like a default. It's more passive. The TPN, we need to engage and turn toward. And that's part of what we're doing in our mindfulness time together, is learning how to engage that part so that we feel more conscious of here. We need them both. We need both the DMN and the TPN. We need them both. What we want to, like, there's some research that's showing that ADHD is linked. So for most of us, we can do the DMN, wandering, thinking, imagining, doing the crossword, whatever. Then we switch to the TPN. We get out and go for a walk. We do the dishes. We sweep. We shovel. Those are things that consciously link in the TPN. There's some research that shows that when you have ADHD, that you do them, that they get overlapped, and that causes problems with how we pay attention. So the medication causes a break between the TPN and DMN. And then they're saying, well, what's the difference between ADHD and just someone who looks at social media all the time? They're calling that vast sensory stimulation, where you're people who are just kind of always, many of us, we can't go more than a few seconds, barely a few minutes without checking our social media, for example, some of us. And so that's creating this new thing that's like ADHD, but it's called vast. And it's when we're overwhelmed with and stimulated, and we can't consciously shift back to the TPN because we've just been kind of rushing, blah, 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 in our brain. So any other questions about the TPN or DM that we want to chat about? Okay, I'll stop the